Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's panel titled Countering Policy Exclusions, Centering Accessibility to Advance the Right to Housing. The slide that we're showing includes the title of the panel and a multicolored image of people walking in front of a row of houses. One of the people in the image is using a wheelchair. It also has the logo for the Live Work Well Research Center on it, which is one of the hosts for today's event. My name is Leah Levac. I use she, her pronouns. I will introduce myself a little more fully in a minute, but let me first go through just a couple of housekeeping details to make sure everyone can access the event as fully as possible. These are also noted on the slide. So first, I want to make sure that folks are aware that we're recording the event so that we can make it available to people who were not available to attend. Come on in. Second, we have a human captioner to provide live and accurate captions for online participants. Those are the captions that are being displayed around the room. And if you're online, we suggest that you do not turn on the captions in Zoom or click on the otter.ai link. Instead, you can use the link that's provided in the chat to access the live captioning website. Because typing in the chat can interfere with screen readers, please don't post in the chat until we invite you to do so during the Q&A at the end. Because we want to optimize our time together, we've emailed you links to a number of resources that the panelists offered, and as well as a PDF copy of the slides. If you're in the room, there's the panelists' bios are on the back of the poster, and you also receive those virtually or electronically so that we don't have to put things in the chat while we're talking. If you have a technical issue and you're in the room, I can't help you. But if you have a technical issue and you're online, please private chat to Jordan Craig, and you can just find Jordan's name in the drop-down menu. For folks in the room, in contrast, if you're online and you need to use the washroom, I don't know where that is for you. But if you're in the building and you need the washroom, right at the door and to the left, there's a women's washroom. Out the door and to the right down the hall, there's a men's washroom. And out the door, around the corner, up the elevator, and right next to the elevator, to the left of the elevator, there's a universal washroom. The floor is G on the button. And if you get lost, call me and we'll send someone to get you back to the room. There are also refreshments in the room, so please feel free to get up and have snacks throughout. We're also taking a few photos. Sharon is taking photos to use for promotional purposes and so on. If you don't want to be in a photo, you can, you can do like this, or you can just let her know after and we'll make sure that we don't use those ones. Okay, so as I said, my name is Leah Levac. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really pleased to be hosting today's conversation. I have long gray and white hair, and if we say that our life is fit into years of 30, then I'm middle-aged. I'm wearing a black shirt. I hold the Canada Research Chair in Critical Community Engagement and Public Policy. I come to this conversation with 15 years of experience working at the intersection between community engaged and led research and critical policy transformations. The work has spanned several policy areas over the past few years, but recently has included collaborating with a brilliant team of folks, some of whom are online right now, on the rights of people living unhoused or precariously housed and their role in shaping housing policy. There are some links to this work in the Word document that we sent you. I'm also part of an international partnership led by my colleague, Dr. Deborah Steenstra, called Engendering Disability Inclusive Development, Genre Handicapé et Développement Inclusif. The partnership works on rights and justice with and for women and girls with disabilities in Canada, South Africa, Vietnam, and Haiti, as well as transnationally. And if you'd like to learn more about Edith Getty, that website is listed in the Word document as well. The slide pictures both the logo for the Edith Getty project and the cover of one of the recent reports we wrote about the experiences of folks with lived experiences of folks with homelessness and housing insecurity and their reflections on the national housing strategy. Can we go back to the land acknowledgement, please? Thank you. So I want to just take a minute to recognize and welcome you to this gathering from wherever you happen to find yourselves. Here in Guelph, we are in the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We're also within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, an agreement between Indigenous people and settlers to peacefully share and care for these lands. It is a tragic irony that people Indigenous to these lands are today disproportionately likely to experience displacement and homelessness. As a settler scholar, I recognize this and I acknowledge the ongoing role of colonization in this fact. And I really want to make explicit our commitment to continuing to learn from and with Indigenous people and to persistently work to respond to these effects of colonization on housing and place, but on all dimensions of life, especially for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks. Next slide, please. So this is the second in a series co-hosted and co-funded by the Live Work Well Research Center and my Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded Canada Research Chair. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Deborah and her team at the Live Work Well Research Center for their support and work on this event and on the series. And I'd like to invite you to stay tuned for upcoming events as part of this series. So, like I said, we're calling this series Countering Policy Exclusions. Each panel reflects on themes that emerge from the intermingling research programs that Deborah and I lead and collaborate on. Our goal with this series, and more broadly often, is to foster dialogue and practice for intersectional solidarities and policymaking with specific attention to how women and girls and gender diverse folks with disabilities are affected by and affect policy change. Given the ongoing and intertwined global crises related to climate change, democratic backsliding, economic inequality, and many other areas, we recognize that the status quo is not an option, and that there is an urgent need for conversation about new ways of understanding and responding to public policy and governance failures. Centering the knowledge and experience of people most affected and often accordingly marginalized by these failures is critical for identifying and responding to them. But this knowledge and experience is often ignored in policy conversations across jurisdictions and policy areas. Within this context, we turn our attention today to housing with a focus on the situation in Ontario. Despite a range of policies, promises, and protections, including a legislated right to housing at the federal level since 2019 in this country, housing for people with disabilities, and specifically that considers the distinct experiences of women and gender diverse folks, remains deeply inadequate in Ontario and across the country. This is true across the housing continuum, which refers to the range of housing people might need over the course of their lifetime, including temporary emergency shelter, transitional and supportive housing, subsidized, affordable, and market rental housing, and home ownership. Factors including ableism, by which I mean simply discrimination against people based on disability, deeply inadequate disability support rates, minimum or inadequate building standards, and others mean that people with disabilities face disproportionate rates of homelessness, housing insecurity, and housing inadequacy. This is also true across generations. Youth homelessness has unique characteristics and consequences, and at the other end of the spectrum, broad commitments to aging in place are strangely unaccompanied by accessibility commitments. Further, women and gender diverse folks with disabilities are especially likely to face a host of other housing-related challenges, such as experiencing homelessness because of violence or abuse, and then facing heightened risks while precariously housed. For example, an analysis of Canada's national housing strategy that I referred to earlier and that I worked on with an incredible group of folks highlights that the three most prominent clusters of barriers to housing relate to accessibility, discrimination, and appropriateness. And of course, these all intersect to create additional challenges for folks. The report goes on to make several recommendations, including for the development of an Indigenous-led strategy to respond to the housing and related needs for Indigenous folks, the application of an intersectional analysis to housing development, and the centering of diverse lived expertise. Carefully countering housing exclusions is urgent, and ever more so in the current political moment, where commitments to equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and even democracy are under threat. And the risk of backsliding across these realms is severe. As ample research suggests, there are big gaps in how Canada and Ontario are securing the right to housing. Our panelists will discuss not only these gaps, but also illustrate how people with disabilities, especially women, girls, and gender diverse folks, provide leadership to counter these failures. Okay, that's enough from me. Let me turn now to today's event and how we will proceed. We can stop sharing the slide. Maybe we should leave them up for one more minute, sorry. We are joined by three outstanding panelists. Their full bios are on the event website, which you've received a link to. And like I said already, there is a paper copy in the room for folks who are interested. The panelists will introduce themselves in turn when they answer their first question, but for now, I'll just point to Roz Gunn, who's here from the YWCA Cambridge, Mike Greer, a disability advocate, and Alex Nelson, who comes to us as a PhD candidate from Western University. We're going to have three parts to the conversation today. First, I'm going to ask each panelist the same question, and they'll introduce themselves, tell you a little bit more about them, and then answer that question. In the second round, I've got a specific question for each of the panelists based more precisely on their area of expertise. And then in the third part, we'll open the conversation to dialogue and exchange. Having said that, if at any point you have a question, something's not clear, please feel free to ask away, and we'll either work it in or make note of it so that we can come back to it. Okay, so I'm going to start now with the first question, and I'm going to turn first to Roz. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? And then could you talk a little bit about some key pieces of legislation and policy that inform the right to adequate housing for women and gender diverse folks, especially those with disabilities in Ontario. And give us a couple of examples of how these policies or their implementation is failing and how women and girls are trying to provide leadership to counter these failures. Did you see my trick? I said one question, I actually.
Thank you so much. So this is Roz speaking. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I am a 30-something white woman. I've got medium length hair with some blonde in it, very much overdue for a color job. And I'm wearing a black blazer with a light blue button down. So I'm here in my capacity as a member of staff at YWCA Cambridge. And there I've done a good chunk of work over the last 6 years, researching and trying to understand the issue of homelessness as it relates to women and gender diverse individuals' experiences of it, and looking at it from a lens of community response, but also policy, where are the levers and where are our governments failing? I will also issue a wee disclaimer that the views shared here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my organization. I only want to say that just in case I say something spicy. I wasn't told I had to say that, just for the record. So in answer to the question, I would be happy to be corrected, but in my mind, I can't really point to a policy that even has the stated goals of addressing or implementing the right to housing for women, girls, and gender diverse individuals. I think we've seen the province take a totally different stance on homelessness, in short, a more punitive one. For example, rather than directing substantial funds to the Housing and Homelessness Service managers, municipalities, we're seeing legislation like Safer Municipalities Act and Strong Mayoral Powers, which are, oh, sorry, if I'm speaking too fast, just let me know. I'm a motormouth. Which are aimed at empowering municipalities to bulldoze encampments and punish institutions and individuals trying to save lives with harm reduction services. We're seeing an outright refusal to raise social assistance rates or raise the minimum wage to a livable wage. We're seeing a refusal to legislate paid sick days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of what they're actually funding, the problem is, and this is both at the federal and the provincial level, it's supply side funding. That is the tens of billions of dollars that have been spent since our government affirmed the right to housing for all in 2019 have largely gone to developers and builders, private companies. So there's a big problem with funneling that money into private hands. In what world does the average business owner voluntarily take lower profits in the name of social good or equity? It's certainly not this one. And that means so much of the housing being built after tens of billions of dollars flowing from the federal government is whatever is cheapest to build and will garner the greatest profit. The feminist sector was able to get the feds to agree to a 25% carve out in the NHS, or National Housing Strategy, funding to be dedicated to housing specifically for women and women-led households. But even that commitment has not materialized. And the problem is our legislation has no teeth. And there's an assumption that developers will do the right thing, and they're not. That means most of these homes aren't fit for families, especially multi-generational families, not for people with disabilities, and they're certainly not actually attainable or affordable, even for the average person, let alone someone living on social assistance or minimum wage. Even middle-income people are largely priced out of this rental and housing market. And so there remains an over-reliance and an unquestioning belief in the market to solve our problems. But if we think about the fact that this crisis really started mounting once governments got out of the business of building housing in the 90s and left it to market forces, it's pretty easy to see the problem. It's why still today, after, again, all of those billions of dollars, only 4% of housing in Canada is non-market. So for comparison, the OECD average is 7%. In the Netherlands, 30%, and even in the UK, they're doing better at 15%. And why are we still here, failing women, gender diverse individuals, and people with disabilities? So many reasons, but I'll pick just a few. And I want to talk about pie and power. So let's talk about pie. So many of these conversations happen, in my mind anyway, on this premise that there's only so many dollars to allocate at any level of government. And while yes, that is technically true, there's a lot of money. The problem is that it's allocated more in politics than anything else, more than on human rights or actually solving the serious issues facing constituents. The issues of gender equity and accessibility are treated as special interest issues and not obligations. Really great example of just the political nature of our government spending is those $200 checks that came out from the province mere months ago. That was $3 billion, and even wealthy people who did not need that $200 were given that check. And then when we consider the billions of dollars, and this is such a sidebar, but not really though, because we're talking about where our money's going. It's the billions of dollars kept offshore. Does our government aggressively go after those lost tax dollars? No, they aggressively go after low income and middle class people. You overpaid that social benefit by $2,000, we want it back. And it's absolutely asinine. We could have a much bigger pie if we close the tax loopholes and we tax the rich adequately. But the thing is, those of us in favor of equitable policy and interventions, i.e. preventing death by poverty and other unavoidable causes, are constantly being challenged to make the business case for why money should be spent on a so-called or perceived minority issue. But I don't see the same challenges being posed when governments opt for tax breaks and credits, which history has shown again and again to only benefit the wealthy and do nothing to alleviate inequity. So when we look to who is still largely running our political systems and who still largely has the mic, if you will, it's white, able-bodied, older men who are still holding the lion's share of power and positions of decision-making. And when we look to how our governments still measure a country or a province's prosperity, it's by GDP. So it's no surprise that we're where we're at with respect to the right to housing, despite it being entrenched in law 6 years ago now, and despite, once again, the tens of billions of dollars being spent by the governments on implementing the right to housing. As for how women, gender diverse individuals, and people with disabilities are providing leadership to counter these failures, well, we know it's the squeakiest wheel that gets the oil. And that's why we're seeing this incredible wave of organizing among tenants, among encampment residents, and among disability rights activists. They're fighting back against punitive legislation and rent evictions. They're mobilizing around rent strikes, and there are increasing numbers of successful cases of this. The fact is that our government still, even in 2025, is sorely lacking a gender equity and accessibility lens on policy. In order to push back on that, we do have to organize. And I love, for instance, this event is just this perfect coming together of its civil society and academics and community activists, and we need more of that. We were talking actually before the panel officially started just about that need for mobilization and collective action. And I think we need to really kind of embrace this idea that it's not that governments don't know better. They do know better, they're just not acting. And I want to take women's homelessness, and am I still good for time? No?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, well, I'll talk about women's homelessness another time, but I yield.
Okay, and I'm getting a t-shirt that says disclaimer, this might get spicy. Thanks, Roz. That was really, I really appreciate you setting the stage for us and sort of calling out some of the big kind of political questions that are part of this conversation. Mike, can I turn it over to you now?
Follow up against that? Sure thing. I'm Mike Greer. I'm a 50-something white male, person with disability and wheelchair user. Have been all my life. So I'm going to come at this question a little bit differently in terms of what I have done and seen. So I've been a disability activist for about 10 to 15 years. Before that, I was in the corporate world. So I've got to see, both sides of kind of the lens with regards to businesses and organizations, how to look at stuff run for profit, and then versus being a voice for those that generally don't have a voice. The biggest legislation issue that I find, and I've always faced when I was working at the Rick Hansen Foundation, talking to developers, talking to municipalities, is basically understanding the value of people with disabilities. There is a disproportionate lack of wealth in us. And I always give this great example when I have conversations. If anyone remembers the show Will and Grace, and there was a great episode of Will and Grace, which Jack was talking about who's the most oppressed group within representation. Was it the LGBTQ plus community? Was it the Hispanic community? Was it the African American community? Seniors? Powerful show, but disability wasn't even mentioned. So it goes to show you how far down people with disabilities are. But when you account for 1 in 5, soon to be 1 in 4 people with disability in the world will have a disability, the social economics of us as a community is powerful. Back in 2019, there was a study done of the economic drivers and economic power of people with disabilities of $30 billion that sits on the sidelines because places are not accessible. Housing by far is the biggest issue. I live in a 2-story home. I'm still fortunate enough that I'm mobile enough to go up and down my stairs. I had an incident back in 2020 where I broke my hip and I was back to using my wheelchair. And it really put to light again of how inaccessible my house was for me. And I've been living in it for quite a few years. But it comes down to, from a policy perspective, Ontario Building Code. That is the greatest barrier towards ensuring that housing is going to be accessible. And it is something that developers and builders fight against change. They look at it as cost win benefit, right? They're going to go to the lowest common denominator. They'll build just to the base of code and not see it because they're looking at it from the life of a community of that small 10% of it. Build it, move on to the next project. Build it, move on to the next project. They don't care who's living in it. They'll get their money one way or another. We're not looking at it from a grand scope of things. And I think that is the biggest challenge. When you have to talk to municipalities, they'll say, we can only do so much. We don't have the levers anymore to compel a builder to go above and beyond code. That's out of our jurisdiction. And the provinces, depending on what government you have in line, they're going to resist because, again, they're being lobbied by the developers to not change. So that is where, when Roz and I are talking about it, of bringing all the communities together to show the power that we do have. Because if it's 1 in 4, that is a big community that can institute fundamental change, to change those policies. And we have to adhere and hold our elected representatives to a higher standard and higher degree to show what is going on. If we don't, then nothing's going to change. Like, I thought by the time I would get to this age, the baby boomers would initiate this change, right? Because, okay, we're going to age into places that are going to meet our needs and requirements. But this is an interesting fact that I learned in talking to a lot of seniors. They'll never say they're disabled. Because again, it comes down to what the world has deemed for people with disabilities. They've put on us such a negative, right? You're on social assistance. You don't have a job. You can't do anything, right? Put you off into the corner. Don't look, don't see. And it's even worse for any minorities that have got, in addition to a disability, on that one, because you're then fighting 3 other types of stereotypes on them as well. So it is really difficult to kind of break those barriers. When I talk about individuals say, yes, I own a home, I'm married, and we've got a lot of disposable income. It's like, how's that possible? I was like, just like everyone else, I went out and got a job. But I had to get a job that took me 10 times longer to find the job because the discriminations that I would face going for those jobs or the places I was going to was inaccessible. So housing is a fundamental human right. And if you think about it, you read it, every person has the right to equal treatment and respect. We don't have that. And I think that is the biggest failure that we have today that we're still fighting against. And I have friends in the States that are terrified of what's going on with their in the disabled community. When you see the word disability being a bad word and being something that could be offensible, be charged if you have it up there. Like, where are we going with this? And it's scary to see if that ever creeps up here. So again, mobilization is going to be the key to bring all these voices together. There's a lot of communities out there that are looking for that voice in a smaller and smaller pie.
Great, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think I really appreciate the addition of, even thinking about what are like our basic building requirements and this notion about people not wanting to identify as having a disability. This is a really important and interesting point as well. Thank you for all those contributions. Alex, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Alex Nelson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a white, queer, disabled person. My disabilities are invisible. And I have shoulder length-ish, brownish hair, glasses, piercings, I'm a queer 80s vibe person, even though I never saw the 80s. In my 30s, so if that locates me in the span of time, then here we go. And I'm wearing a white t-shirt, houndstooth blazer, and a bolo tie. I am a person with lived experience of homelessness and going through the child welfare system and experiencing those things at the intersection of queerness and disability. It's really important to me to locate myself in relation to the structures of the housing system in that way, because it tells you a little bit about where my knowledge is coming from. And I think when we're talking about sometimes these power dynamics that are invisible, it's really important that we position ourselves so that those power dynamics can in part become more visible, more tangible, so that we can deconstruct them and unsettle them through our work, speaking to each other and collaborating with each other. And so that's how I come into this space. I'm a white settler person. I live in a place colonially known as London, Ontario. So I'm not from this community here, but I'm happy to be here. So thank you. I'm a PhD candidate at Western University, as Leah introduced, and my research is on lived experience, leadership, and advocacy in the housing and homelessness sector. I think it's one of the most powerful and transformative pieces of work that we can be doing together because it really does do that work of unsettling power. And I come at this work originally thinking about my lived experience, not necessarily connected to my experience of disability. But I think the more that we can see our struggles as linked, the more we can do this work of challenging systems that are so harmful and exploitative. For a long time, I worked for an organization called the National Right to Housing Network, working around the right to housing for communities, doing community engagement and thinking about how we can make sure engagement with communities when it comes to decision making is actually meaningful and actually harnessing that transformative potential, because it isn't always doing that. And sometimes that engagement is not only falling short, but is actually reproducing the kinds of harm that people face within the system. Especially for queer people and disabled people who come into spaces and really on whose knowledge and backs this system has been built. And I think we have to really acknowledge that and challenge it so that our policy can look different in the future. Right now, federally implemented under the National Housing Strategy Act, we have a few accountability mechanisms that I think hold a lot of potential, but we really have to push for the implementation of that possibility. One of those pieces is the Federal Housing Advocate, an independent advocate who collects stories and testimony and undertakes reviews of housing rights violations across the country, and then makes recommendations that the Minister of Housing has to respond to. Another piece of that work is the National Housing Council, which forms review panels to also undertake federal reviews into particular issues around violations of the right to housing. Some of the reviews that have already taken place, one by the Federal Housing Advocate looked at encampments, one by the National Housing Council looked at the financialization of housing, some of which my colleagues on this panel have spoken about. And right now there's a review taking place on the failure to eliminate homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse people. Actually, if you have testimony that you want to submit, submissions close on Friday, I believe. And so they're really looking for testimony from people who have been impacted by these systems. And I think that's an important place that we can use our experiences and voices and then push really hard to hold our government accountable. That being said, I know personally that these systems are things that we should be wary of, because they have so often not only failed us, but deepened the harm that we experience across communities and across experiences. I come at this work on housing from the world of homelessness and trying to prevent homelessness. I think it's important to note that homelessness, I believe, is a disability rights issue. A survey of 500 women, girls, and gender diverse people undertaken by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network showed that 79% of women, girls, and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness are disabled. Most people had 3 or more disabilities that they were living with. And that's not an accident. That is how our system is constructed to manufacture harm and oppression for our communities. And I think it's really important to note that in that survey, it showed that the most common cause for people's most recent experience of homelessness was due to the breakup of a romantic relationship, showing that for women, girls, and gender diverse people, our housing security often relies on other people. In a Toronto community housing study, it was found that 90% of people who lost their housing because of a third party's actions were women and gender diverse people. And so I think all of these systems, all of these structures, the way they coalesce to manufacture harm are things that we have to be talking about all the time. I think too, one of the things that survey showed was there are disabilities that are currently not really being acknowledged as in terms of how we think about accessibility. One, for example, was people living with multiple chemical and environmental sensitivities. I know the story of one person who actually has to live in a tent because there is no option for her housing, because every situation that she could find herself in, whether that's accessible, affordable housing, congregate living, triggers her disability in a way that is could kill her. And I think it's really serious that we talk about all of the different ways that accessibility is experienced and needed by people that is currently not being addressed by the system that we have. I want to share if I can quickly, one story. In 2020, an advocate that I've worked with who is disabled and supports informally her peers and community members with disabilities was working tirelessly because when during COVID, the landlord-tenant board system switched into virtual operation, suddenly her community members could no longer access their hearings, their information, their documents, because everything moved online. But it wasn't matched with equivalent accessibility features. So people could lose their housing because they simply could not access the system that switched online overnight, but didn't come with those important supports. And so she was doing this work by herself with no training and expertise, but knowing that it was her responsibility to make sure her community members stayed housed. And so I think, focusing on what are we doing to keep each other alive, knowing that our systems do not always do that work for us. How do we care for each other and show solidarity, knowing that we're up against immense violence? I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate that. Both the stories and also the sort of broader structural analysis of this idea of constructing homelessness for people with disabilities is really powerful. Thank you all. I'm going to turn now to each of our panelists and ask them a specific question focused in a little bit more on some more of the details of their work. And then we're going to have no shortage of material for a really rich conversation. Roz, can I turn back to you? I want to ask you about the recent report that you co-authored in Cambridge, where you talk about the concept of a service desert to describe housing and homelessness supports for women and gender diverse folks in the city of Cambridge, which is just down the road from us here. Can you say a little bit more about what that means, and then talk to us about some of the sort of major constraints and limitations around housing in this region, in Cambridge and in this region, and then what's happening in response?
Sure, thank you. Yes, so YWCA Cambridge, I co-authored a research report, and it was looking at It was the second in a series. So the first research report, we actually interviewed women who had or are currently experiencing homelessness to ask about their experiences and their experience specifically with violence while living unhoused. And then from that, actually, I should backtrack a little. I'm going to try not to be too verbose, but I'm going to go quickly back to why we did all of this research, and then I'm going to talk about the service desert. So women's homelessness, vastly understood, vastly under-researched until the last couple of years. We're finally starting to understand women's homelessness is a crisis, and there's not really a good reason why women wouldn't experience homelessness in the same numbers as men are experiencing it, but women's homelessness tends to be invisible. So we are not seeing them. And so the way we typically measure homelessness, plain time count, relies on shelter use and other sort of homeless service use. But women, and this came out in our research too, the first research report, Project Willow, they don't use a lot of those services, especially if they're co-ed, out of fear for their safety. So we were on a mission. We started this mission back in 2021 of just getting women's homelessness on the agenda. And so then the next step, we kind of raised the voices of women experiencing homelessness in the region. And then we really wanted to focus in on Cambridge. So Cambridge and this concept of Cambridge as a service desert really came out of conversations with service providers in Cambridge. All of us, we were all saying this is a desert for social services. And how does that happen? Well, we're a part of the region of Waterloo, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge. But Cambridge is cut off from Kitchener and Waterloo by the 401. If you want to go from Cambridge to Kitchener or Cambridge to Waterloo and you have to take public transportation, you better book a good 3 hours of your day for one way there. And so there's a kind of this assumption, this prevailing assumption that if we have a service in Kitchener and Waterloo, well then good, the region is served. And so it just kept happening that funding dollars were going to Kitchener and Waterloo, and we weren't getting the same services in Cambridge. So across the region of Waterloo, the shelter system keeps fluctuating with like shelters closing and temporary shelters opening, closing. But let's say it's about 500 shelter beds across the region. Until recently, only 78 of those were dedicated to women, and those were all in Kitchener. In Cambridge, there was one shelter, about 80 bed capacity, men only. There was nothing for women. And so that's where this kind of concept of service desert came in. It's like, well, we're trying to support women, and it's not even like, for instance, one organization, their mandate might not even be serving women experiencing homelessness, but if she comes to your door, you're not saying, get lost, like, because you know there's nowhere else for her to go. And so the second report was really talking to the service providers, but we also talked to political representatives to say, like, why is this happening? Again, yes, one of the big reasons was that there's that inequitable distribution of funds. But why are the funds being distributed so inequitably? Well, because the responsibility for responding to housing and homelessness was downloaded to municipalities without complementing funding. And so the region is tasked with responding to homelessness, which is a multi-billion-dollar task, but they don't have funding to go with it. So yeah, that pie, to really batter that metaphor I keep wanting to use, but that pie is actually small. And so this research report was really just trying to shine the light on what's happening and what the detriment is to our community. And so we're seeing, obviously, across Ontario, encampments are exploding. And the same is true in Cambridge. And I don't know if anyone is familiar with the kind of culture in Cambridge, but I would say NIMBYism, to be quite frank, is like, it's on a whole different level in Cambridge. There is not a lot of compassion for individuals experiencing homelessness. And I think that kind of also goes into how our political leaders are acting or acting to respond to homelessness. I think, yeah, I guess that was kind of, I think that was it. Yeah. Unless I have more time, I can talk about.
Do you want to just say a little bit about the new shelter?
Oh, yeah.
Like the response?
Oh, yeah. So we started this mission back in 2021 to get women's homelessness on the agenda. And so I cannot believe I forgot to say that. And so we wanted to show women's homelessness. Yes, it's real. Yes, you have to pay attention to it because, as I said, the squeakiest wheel gets the oil. So we wanted to really, really show that women are experiencing homelessness. They're hiding. They're exchanging sex for a place to sleep. They're sleeping in unsafe situations. And Alex, you pointed to a really important one. They're staying in unsafe environments like homes, abusive relationships. And so we wanted to make that case. So make it this kind of invisible problem visible. And so those research reports sort of like laid the groundwork for us to then go to our governments at all levels and to say, we need a women's shelter and we need it now. But the other offshoot of that was we built a lot of community support around this issue of women's homelessness. So Cambridge residents started getting kind of embarrassed that, like, wait, there's nothing for women in Cambridge? That is egregious. Why aren't more people talking about this? And so we were actually approached. So we've been trying to find a location for a permanent shelter. Very difficult to do. There's not a lot of regionally owned land in Cambridge. There's not a lot of land that we can see, or buildings that we could retrofit or renovate. And so a church actually approached us and said, we've got this massive basement. It used to be a childcare center. Could this be a temporary space for your shelter? And we said, oh, maybe. So we went to the region, and also we sent an entire proposal to the region of Waterloo for a brand new women's emergency shelter. And this shelter was a different model. So typically a homeless shelter is like the 3 hots and a cot kind of model. Get out in the morning, you can come back in the evening. During the day, I don't know, good luck. This shelter, 24/7 services on site, mental health, physical health, cultural supports, all of it in there. And women do not have to leave. This is their home for as long as they're with us, and there's no limit to their stay because there is no affordable or supportive or transitional housing in Cambridge. And so the region endorsed our proposal, and it was costly because that model costs a lot more than your standard homeless shelter model. And so they did endorse it. And so they agreed to renovate the basement of this church for a temporary shelter. And we opened just a couple months ago, and only 20 beds. The idea is just smaller shelter models are just, it's more trauma informed, can actually really facilitate better outcomes for individuals when they're not feeling like they're just warehoused on a mat in a room beside 30 other people, or 50, 60, 70 other people. And so, yeah, that's sort of the story. We're kind of like taking it from advocacy to action, and then actually getting this shelter open. It's a great example of sort of how that collective action can really bring good things to fruition.
Thanks for that, Roz. That's well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Also, yeah. Mike, I'm wondering if I can turn to you now and ask you if you can talk a little bit about how some of these failures in accessible housing across the spectrum, like you've talked about, how do they then spill over and undermine well-being and livelihoods for people with disabilities in other ways? And what do we need to change in terms of how we talk about and advance housing development in order to start to center accessibility in the conversations?
Great question. There's a lot of great points, and there's a lot of great things that have to, I think, all happen in kind of tandem to be able to do that one. And put Roz on the spot for like 2 seconds. The basement in the church, does it have an elevator access?
My colleague on council in Cambridge just texted me to remind me it is accessible. Yes.
What level?
It's physically accessible.
Yeah.
And all considerations that we were able to in terms of lighting and doorways and
yeah, and that's great, and that's part of what I'm bringing up for this scenario, because we've got too many people think, my building's accessible. I've got an automatic door opener, I've got a ramp, and I've got accessible grab bars in the washroom. Mm-hmm. Okay, what about someone with low vision? What about someone with a hearing disability? Mm-hmm. Right? Complex needs, complex requirements are all over the map. My experience in the buildings would be vastly different from someone maybe in a scooter or in an electric wheelchair, right? Or with low vision. We have to really take a step back and really look at it from a broader scope and a broader understanding of what a physical space is. And housing's no different. Housing's the worst. When we think about, when we're looking at housing, especially rental housing or affordable housing, and the provincial minimum is 15%. The definition of an accessible unit is a turning radius in a washroom, right? If you've got someone there that needs to be able to transfer from their power chair to the bed and needs a hoist, the infrastructure is not in that building to be able to add that as a retrofit or a later addition, right? So you've got to look at more and more aspects of what a complex need, complex requirement is for that given space. So we advocate for universal design. We advocate for aging in place. We advocate for housing that's going to, grow with the needs of the user today and the user tomorrow. We're not designing our spaces to be able to successfully house individual today and tomorrow. As I said before, the builder is going to go to the lowest common denominator and build it and then move on. They're not looking at the aspect of what's going to happen down the line. And even an accessible unit is not guaranteed for someone with disability. It's the first come, first serve approach as well. If the unit's available, they rent it out. So you've got that to contend with as well. I'd like to see in conjunction to help anyone with chronic homelessness, other complex needs requirements, because I was on social assistance and that program is designed not to get you off of it. It's designed to keep you on it permanently. I wanted to go to school or any assistance that I could have. No, we're going to claw things back. But I'm trying to better myself to get off of social assistance. You should be able to provide me guidances and help to get it off. That wasn't there. Universal basic income, I'm sure we've all heard that terminology, is one of the great equalizers because it's going to get everyone the ability to at least have a baseline to work with, to be able to potentially afford housing. And that goes in conjunction with, we need provinces, we need federal governments to get back into building housing. Developers are not going to do it unless they're mandated to do it. You look at the city of Guelph, I think it was the other week, our mayor said, or there was an article that there's tons of development that's been greenlit. Developers are not building it because it's not financially right for them to build at this point in time. So they're going to sit on that land. So there's no quote unquote, we need to build more housing. No, we need to put the laws in place to get the developers to build on housing. So that's a huge thing. And then we look at the social benefits towards making places more accessible. We're going to reduce the cost of costly retrofits. So there's the social aspect of things. If we do a retrofit, where does all that stuff go? Landfill. That's a big issue there. We're going to improve the health and welfare of individuals. You're housed, your mental state improves. You feel that you're part of the community. You feel you're worth something. So that's a big challenge as well. That's going to take loads off hospitals. I know a few people that are in their 30s and 40s that are in long-term care facilities because that's the only place they can be put. So they're sitting there, not with their peers. They're sitting with people that are 30, 40 years older than them. And that's social isolation for them as well. So there's so many complex threads to it, and it's decoupling it and rethinking about how we can put the social paradigms back into place to make it more beneficial. And it's a long and it's sometimes demoralizing. I've been in this game for far too long. I see 2 steps forward and 4 steps back. And it really is that community together where we have the power of the voice as one, where we're going to be a huge influence. Again, 1 in 4. Normalization has to happen. For anyone who's wearing these, that's an accessibility aid. Welcome to the community, right? But these have been normalized. That's what we have to do when I'm looking at my chair. My chair hasn't been normalized. They already have a whole bunch of pre-notions. That's why some people are fearful to disclose their disability. I sit in this one, so I have no recourse to hide unless I have a big blanket. And they're going to look at me and say, what are you doing, floating around? But it's just to improve the social outcomes. And I think what we can do on that is work together and bring some great voices together, but it's just showing the ROI, that return on investment. As I said before, globally, trillions of dollars in the disabled community sits at the sidelines. We're natural problem solvers. We are a force to be reckoned with if we just continue to keep going forward, but it's tough. It is really tough. On that down note.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and I really appreciate sort of the building, this importance of sort of thinking collectively and strategically about, how we try and move and pull the threads, many of the threads all at once. Alex, I'll turn to you now, and I'd just like to ask you to talk a little bit more about the distinct role or contribution of women, girls, and gender diverse folks with disabilities and who have lived experience of housing security and their work in advancing accessible housing. Can you just talk about those contributions in policy and practice? Thanks.
Yeah. So as a person with lived experience, I located myself and I described why I identify as a person with lived experience. I'm really drawn to the work of disability scholar Alison Kafer, author of the book Feminist Queer Crip, who describes her identity and self-location as political and relational. Political because our identity and our existence is political as queer disabled people, and relational because our identity is formed through being in community and through learning from one another and from learning from our histories, our lineages, our legacies, and the knowledge on whose shoulders our work is built. And so I think lived experience is a unique embodied knowledge. It's here in our spaces and it's informed the operation of the housing system, even if it is not acknowledged and even if we have not been present at the table. Often the extraction of that knowledge has been very violent and has marginalized us further. Our knowledge has been used against us. And it's really important that we are at the table to be able to make decisions about our lives, our communities, our families, and ultimately our future. And I often quote lived experience advocate Rob Robinson from New York, who says, "You're either at the table or on the menu." But I think when we are talking about disability, there's actually a third option, which is you are not considered at all. You are not assumed to be part of the conversation to either be at the table or on the menu. And that omission is murderous. And I think it's really important that we sit with that when we're thinking about what the stakes are for people to be involved in making decisions and making policies that are going to impact them. That participation is so incredibly urgent. And we know that people die when their needs are not taken into consideration by the policies that are being implemented. And so I couldn't take this more seriously when I talk about why people with lived experience have to be at the table to make decisions. And I think the structures that we have to do that engagement often reproduce, as I mentioned earlier, the harm that people have experienced in the system. So we have to really work deeply to do unlearning of the systemic biases that we have in our heads and in our hearts, and do this work in deep collaboration. I've done really amazing work funded through the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate with, I think, one of my colleagues, Wayne Malenfant, is on the call. I see their name. Looking at the right to housing for gender diverse people, two-spirit, transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse people. Thinking about what community held knowledge do we have that our systems can learn from and enact. And I think a lot of the ways that we act in protest, in resistance, through refusal, are things that I think have made a significant difference to help, as I've mentioned, keep our communities alive. I wanted to mention quickly on Mike's point about the use of institutions as a form of housing for people. It's completely unacceptable. The fact that people are institutionalized with no medical or legal reason to be there just because there is no affordable, accessible housing in communities. I think that's absolutely unacceptable. And it really shows the ways that the system enacts violence and also does not think about people with disabilities. A report from Dawn Canada describes how younger women and gender diverse people are increasingly being institutionalized in this way as a form of housing. And I think we really need to work to resist that. There's actually a case, the Disability Rights Coalition versus Nova Scotia. If you work in housing and disability, you may be familiar with this case. But it is a case on this topic where people who have been institutionalized for, again, no medical or legal reason, just because their needs and accessibility needs were considered too expensive to find them housing in community, are fighting their government, and actually they won. That being said, Nova Scotia is appealing to re-institutionalize and to fight that when that happened. And so I think, it shows that even though we have these structures that are intended to enact justice, sometimes the path to justice means that people who hold power claw it back really, really hard. And I know one advocate who I've worked with who was housed after the case won and got to experience housing in the community of her choice for the first time in decades. And I think that is what we're fighting for. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Alex. I think that's really powerful. And although it's a bit of a jump, I've been thinking a lot actually lately about the ways in which governments like actively try and re-entrench exclusion through sort of resisting movements that are afoot. And it is very concerning. I agree with you. I need my spicy t-shirt again. Those were all really excellent and fulsome contributions. I'm very grateful to all of you for your insights, for thinking about a really wide range of different kinds of challenges, the way they intersect with each other, and also for really thinking about the different kinds of strategies that people are using to respond. I think that that's really important and something that we don't want to lose sight of in this conversation that can often be really heavy and turn into sort of a conversation about a lack of power. And so I think it's really important always to elevate also the ways that folks are responding in spite of these kinds of barriers. Okay, thank you again all so much for such a rich conversation. Let me just pause for a minute and ask our audience to extend our gratitude. Really covered even more ground than I anticipated. And I set it up, so that's pretty impressive. So I really appreciate all of your insights and your really sort of gracious, your really gracious sharing of your personal and professional and scholarly expertise. It really enriches, I think, the way we can think about this question of housing and rights and disability and gender and their intersections. I want to also thank everybody who's been working behind the scenes to make today happen. Deborah Steenstra, Lenore Latta, Jordan Craig is online supporting us. Benedicta Hughes, Carrie Shimon, who's not here today, but has been helping out Vanessa Bonham, Catherine Reinders, who is taking notes and also asking difficult questions, and our captioner, Luella Arneson. Thank you, Luella, for being here with us today. I hope that everybody will join us for our next event in the Countering Policy Exclusion series in the middle of May. We'll be rejoining after whatever happens in the federal election to talk about what we might expect from Canada on the international stage when it comes to upholding the rights and supports for folks with disabilities. And then in the fall, we'll be focusing in on the local level and thinking about accessibility and practices within municipalities. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today, virtually and in person.